It includes things like rental obligation, family units, maximum number of senior units, income distribution, and bedroom distribution. All of those things have to be considered with the new construction obligation. And of course, in addition to the new construction obligation, which Lambertville has addressed through a vacant land and adjustment, and that can be discussed later, the town also has a rehabilitation obligation as well. So when we talk about affordable housing in New Jersey, for better or worse, there are a variety of types of obligations and also subcomponents of the obligation that has to be considered and has to be factored into exactly how a municipality is going to meet its number and what units can contribute to each component of their obligation. So in 2015, this is the year that really kicked off this current process that Lambertville and every other municipality in the state is engaged in. And that's because in 2015, we had a New Jersey Supreme Court decision generally referred to these days as the Mount Laurel 4 decision. And in there, the New Jersey Supreme Court transferred jurisdiction for affordable housing away from the state agency over to our New Jersey Superior Courts, which are often at the county level. And when we say transfer, what that more specifically means is that the jurisdiction for determining the affordable housing obligation now sits with Superior Court as opposed to the state agency, meaning Superior Court is responsible for determining the obligation or calculating it where necessary. They're also responsible for determining the permitted strategies, what methods a town can use to meet its affordable housing obligation, although it certainly has a lot of guidance and it relies to the extent possible on previous rules adopted by the state agency, the Council on Affordable Housing. Also, the courts are now responsible for approving housing plans that formerly sat with the state agency, but now it's judges and special masters, assigned planners to assist the judges. These folks are responsible for reviewing and approving housing elements written by municipalities. And then lastly, the courts have also taken over ongoing monitoring requirements to ensure that what a municipality indicated it would do to meet its affordable housing obligation in a housing plan actually was completed, and was completed in a way that meets the various and applicable rules to those units. The other thing that's changed, in addition to simply transferring the jurisdiction to the courts, it also means that Fair Share Housing Center is an interested party in all municipal cases. So every time a town enters this court process, Fair Share is standing there to participate and assist the municipality in determining an obligation and strategies to meet that obligation that will ultimately be set forth in a housing plan. And so what this means is, now that municipalities have entered the court process, it really gives them two choices. First, a municipality can settle with Fair Share Housing Center, as Lambertville has done, or alternatively, it can go through the trial process. Nearly all municipalities have settled with Fair Share Housing Center. There remain a handful, more than a handful, but there remain some municipalities that have not yet settled. But I think every municipality is moving in the direction of settlements. It appears to be in their intention. Those towns that did not settle and went through court found that doing so created significant costs and did not have the desired results in the sense of the obligation they sought and so forth. And so why do municipalities settle with Fair Share? It's to avoid a costly trial. There was a trial that's been well publicized and frequently discussed in Mercer County. It took 41 days and untold thousands of dollars in order to complete that trial. Towns also settle with Fair Share because it gives them the ability to have a lower affordable housing obligation, in particular, a lower third round affordable housing obligation. They also settle because it gives them more favorable affordable housing strategies, and other terms. There are certain allowances, certain flexibilities that municipalities, including Lambertville, are able to obtain through the mediation process. And so once settlement has been completed, what does that agreement typically address? And for those of you that have read the city's settlement agreement, you'll see this addressed in Lambertville. So it addresses three major things. First, simply the affordable housing obligation. What is each component of the affordable housing obligation? What is the rehabilitation? What is the prior round? And what is the third round obligation? What number of units and credits must be provided to meet that obligation? It also addresses satisfaction of the obligation. And so that means, are there any adjustments that have been granted to a municipality? In Lambertville's case, the adjustment was a vacant land adjustment to reflect the lack of vacant and developable land. It also addresses not only the number of units that will meet the total obligation, but it addresses how will the town meet its rental obligation? How will it comply with the family obligation, the various income distribution obligations, and the same thing for bedrooms, if bedroom obligation needs to be specifically addressed. And then lastly, the settlement agreement addresses ongoing monitoring to ensure that the municipality is regularly reporting to the court about the progress in satisfying its obligation and the continued affordability of its affordable units. And so what does this process look like? And this is, I'm going to try to, what I'm going to show is what the typical process is, and we can talk a little bit about how things have worked out specifically in Lambertville. And so first and foremost, after that 2015 Mount Laurel 4 decision, a municipality will file for declaratory judgment. And that is simply the town, as I like to say, the town essentially raising its hand to the court and saying, I want to comply, and please give me protection from developer litigation called builder's remedy during this compliance process. And so Lambertville did that. It filed for declaratory judgment where it told the court that it very much wants to comply and entered this process. Once the declaratory judgment has been filed, municipalities enter into mediation with Fair Share Housing Center and any developer interveners. Some towns, like Lambertville, have a small number of interveners. I've worked with other municipalities that have 7. So the number of interveners varies greatly across the state. The folks that are involved with mediation is certainly going to be Fair Share and any developer interveners, but it's also going to include municipal professionals and officials, meaning typically it's attorneys, planners, council members, sometimes the mayor, sometimes planning board members. It depends on the structure of the municipality and how they like to operate. And we also have the special master. The special master serves as the actual mediator for these mediations between the various parties. The mediation addresses the major components of the settlement agreement, including the affordable housing obligation, where there's development of intervener sites. The mediation will specifically address how, if and how those sites should be developed. It also addresses any adjustments. In the case of Lambertville, it addressed the vacant land adjustment. How was the obligation adjusted downward to reflect the amount of vacant and developable land in the city? And then last, but certainly not least, it addresses the compliance strategies. What strategies will meet each component of the affordable housing obligation? And one of the overarching themes of these mediations is the fact that because it's part of litigation, they're confidential negotiations regarding the specific terms. Yes, municipalities may be able to discuss publicly that they're in mediation regarding sites, but the details of those mediations, the density, the set aside, the, for example, the appearance of the buildings, that is something that has, in my experience, been kept confidential until settlement has been reached or has been nearly reached with the various interveners. And that's typical throughout the state, as I said, due to the nature of the litigation. Once a settlement agreement has been reached, the process for approving it is for governing body approval. It typically appears before a governing body meeting. The governing body, the council, will approve it using a resolution. Once the settlement agreement has been executed, it goes to a fairness hearing. And that's a hearing where the special master reviews the settlement agreement or agreements, issues a report, and there's a hearing where the judge considers the special master's report, considers any public comment that's been submitted for or against the settlement agreement, and ultimately, if appropriate, approves the settlement agreement. And they do so via an order on fairness and preliminary compliance. And in that order, it states things such as the settlement agreement is approved subject to several conditions. Those conditions, first and foremost, are implementation of the settlement agreement, and that is ultimately adoption of a housing element and fair share plan, which includes not only the master plan document, but also all of the implementing documents such as resolutions, various ordinances to expedite development of the site, etc. That housing plan is required to be adopted by the planning board as part of their master plan. However, it also must go to the governing body for their endorsement. And once that step has been completed, a municipality then goes back to court for a compliance hearing. And it's at that time that the special master once again issues a report reviewing the housing plan that was submitted and all of the implementing documents, making recommendations to the judge. The judge, during the compliance hearing, considers the special master's report, any public comment that's been received, and if appropriate, issues a judgment of repose. And what that judgment of repose does is it formally approves the housing plan and gives the municipality protection against builder's remedy or exclusionary zoning litigation. And so it allows fundamentally for that municipality to move forward in implementation of its housing plan, and doing so while maintaining its zoning without fear of that builder's remedy litigation. Now, in this city's case, because the town has gone back to seek an amended settlement agreement, it's my understanding that the upcoming hearing will address not only fairness, but also compliance. And that's typical where you have amended settlement agreements. And it's typical to, in order to help expedite the process of having the affordable units actually produced within the municipality. And so as we go through this process, like I said, we have this fairness hearing. And one of the things I wanted to highlight outside of just simply going through the process is more specifically what's considered at the fairness hearing. And that is really based on two pieces of criteria. The first is the court asks, or I should say the court considers, what is the number of and the rationale for the affordable units? What is the number and the rationale for the affordable housing obligation set forth in the settlement agreements? And is that fair and reasonable to low and moderate income households? The second question asked is what other contributions are made toward affordable housing? So what other contributions, how is the municipality met its rental obligation? How is it providing for family housing? Is it providing ongoing monitoring to ensure that affordable units today remain affordable in the future, consistent with the deed restriction? The purpose of the fairness hearing is to determine whether the settlement agreement is fair and reasonable to low and moderate income households. And I think that's something that a lot of folks, even municipal folks, don't necessarily understand. The question is specific to how are affordable households being treated in that settlement agreements ultimately. And so, as I said, the order approving the settlement agreement speaks heavily to implementation, requiring that housing element and fair share plan to be submitted, requiring implementing ordinances and resolutions. One of the key requirements is housing plan adoption within 120 days. That's the typical time frame. And when I say housing plan adoption, it's not just simply adoption of the master plan document, that housing element, but it's also adoption of all of the implementing ordinances and the resolutions. The compliance hearing on the adopted housing element and fair share plan, yes, the court reviews it and presumably issues an approval if it finds it appropriate, but more specifically, what the compliance hearing asks, or what's considered, is whether or not the town's housing plan is consistent with the settlement agreement. Because again, it's that settlement agreement that lays the framework for how the municipality will meet its affordable housing obligation, what units will be utilized to satisfy each component of the obligation, etc. It also asks, of course, does the overall housing plan and do the specifics of the various strategies and methods, do they meet the applicable rules? Do they meet the applicable COA rules? Do they meet the supplemental case law that folks are having to rely upon these days? That judgment of repose, as I said, addresses a finding of compliance that yes, the town has done what was required in the settlement agreement. Yes, the plan meets the applicable rules. Addresses that all important immunity from builder's remedy litigation, ongoing monitoring, and any ongoing implementation of the housing plan that might be specific to that particular municipality. And so that's really what I would expect from Lambertville's upcoming court hearing, for the court to consider whether or not the amended settlement agreement is fair and reasonable to low and moderate income households, whether or not the accompanying housing plan is consistent with that settlement agreement and consistent with the applicable rules. And before I close, I just want to say one thing. I've had a chance to review the city's settlement agreement, and I'm pleased to say that I think that it is advantageous to the city, and I can see some points of flexibility that the city was able to negotiate for itself. And so as I review this, I feel pleased for the city that it was able to obtain those points of flexibility and some of the, I'm sure, hard-won negotiations in the settlement agreement. And I say that after having reviewed several dozen settlement agreements across the state. And there are certainly some that have been worked out to be more advantageous to municipalities than others. And I think that Lambertville did a good job of getting some advantages for itself in there. But so with that, I wanted to wrap up and turn things over to Reverend Eric Dobson. But of course, I'll be here for questions and answers later on tonight.
Thank you, Beth. I just want to jump in real quick in between. That was very educational, and I know a lot of technical information for folks to try to absorb, which is unfortunately the nature of this issue. So I think we'll be able to answer questions in the Q&A session and hopefully have a discussion there. And I just wanted to remind folks that we'll have plenty of time for questions after Reverend Dobson's presentation. And so we're excited to hear from you, Eric. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you all for having me. Thank you to the City Council and the Mayor for allowing me to be here and share what I hope to be an informational session and bring bring a little personal story to this discussion. And thanks, Beth. Always does a fantastic job of explaining this very technical process here in the state of New Jersey. And I love Beth discussion about what Fair Share Housing Center's role is. And I want to be clear, our role is, as she stated, to assist municipalities and to come in compliance with the law. So I'm going to try to talk about, again, a little background in the history of why Mount Laurel was created, the opportunities that it presents, and so I'll give a little, sometimes we talk about these things in terms of units and affordable housing units, and I think we forget to talk about, we're talking about people, people when it comes to what the doctrine includes: very low income, moderate income, housing for seniors, housing for those with special needs, housing for veterans. So when we talk about units, we're talking about people, the opportunity for people to live in a town such as Lambertville and throughout the state of New Jersey. And part of that process is really re-educating ourselves about what affordable housing is, and re-educating ourselves about this history of housing in this country. So I'll start a little bit there, and I'll end with my personal connection to Lambertville. So let's back up for a moment and talk about why was Mount Laurel actually needed. Well, when you think about it, you think about all on the heels of the civil rights movement, coming out of the civil rights movement and the assassination of Dr. King and the Vietnam War, and how development in towns were happening throughout the state of New Jersey. There were two tracks of housing that was being developed, suburban housing as well as city housing. And at that time, during the 1970s, there was a move towards creating, moving out of the cities into the suburbs. Now, this was all well intended for folks who had the income to afford the suburban communities. Now, how that happened, you have to research history and say, how did the suburbs come about, and how was the suburbs what they were intentionally created to do? And they were created to segregate. So after World War II, the GI Bill was created, and the GI Bill was an opportunity for those who fought in the war to get mortgages, federally backed mortgages, not only get mortgages, but get college loans or to get business loans for all those who fought in the war. Unfortunately, African Americans and Latinos didn't get those GI Bills, so it was exclusively stated in the federal housing policy. And the practice of this was for opportunities for folks to move in the suburbs, and to the exclusion of people of color. So the suburbs were created for housing that was exclusive. And so that robbed opportunities for many people of color to be able to afford or to get access to quality housing, to have access to quality education, health and food securities, and relegated folks to the cities where the towns and the states at the time was disinvesting in the cities and actually using tax dollars to subsidize the highways, the roads, and the infrastructures needed for these towns. So opportunities was afforded for some and not for others. So in the 70s, we saw there were folks living in Mount Laurel at the time, African-American folks living in Mount Laurel, and they were living there since Reconstruction. And when we talk about Reconstruction, again, that's a re-education of the history of this country around housing. The Reconstruction laws that were instituted during the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were key components of creating citizenship and the protection of citizenship. Prior to that, folks who tried to live in certain areas of the community, they were victimized by violence, victimized because of the color of their skin, excluded because of the color of their skin. So these laws were created because at the time, Mount Laurel was using its zoning powers to exclude folks from living there, to having apartments. And so when we talk about this law, we cannot forget to talk about people. This was about people, the same people who fought in the war, who served this country, who were Americans. And sometimes we forget that because of the racialized founding of this country, you forget that African Americans fought in every war that this country ever had. The Revolutionary War, they fought with the promise of freedom. That didn't happen. The Civil War, they fought with the promise of freedom and opportunity. That didn't happen. Every war, actually the first person killed in the Revolutionary War was an African American. And so the blood, sweat, and tears and the sacrifice that every American who fought in this war, some were afforded opportunities, others were excluded. So that's what the Mount Laurel Doctrine, we have these laws because as a nation, we intentionally excluded some and gave opportunities to others. And we're talking about people. So when we talk about affordable housing in this state, we need to consider that these are people who pay their taxes, who have jobs, who want to raise their children in a decent, safe environment, and who are part of the citizenship of, you name the town. In this town, we're talking about Lambertville. So there is a re-education happening, and I highly recommend, if you want to see to the extent of the laws that were created to exclude, there's a book that was written by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, and it documents the history of housing segregation and how the suburbs were created intentionally to exclude. And so the law came about because there were folks living in the suburbs in substandard housing, and we wanted to have the opportunity to create apartments and the towns were using zoning powers to exclude. So that's a little bit about why Mount Laurel came about. We forget that history. And it's one thing that we've learned from history, I always say, is that we don't learn from history because we don't explore it. We need to explore the history around housing in this country and the length of the extent that this country has used and the tools and the strategies to use to segregate. And so when we think about one of the greatest towns in the country, Lambertville, and I'll tell you why I say that in a minute. You think about the opportunities that presents itself to create housing that's affordable, to allow folks who are either raised in Lambertville, who either graduated from college and want to live in an unbelievable town, who has visited Lambertville from a child. And that's where my story comes in. I grew up in North Philadelphia, a two-parent family. My mom and dad worked. My mom got injured and could no longer work. And I grew up in the Logan section of Philadelphia, and my dad always had a desire to live in the suburbs. Again, we were working, and it was two-family, but we couldn't afford it. But he would take us trips. He would often take us trips out to the suburbs. And one of the favorite trips that he would take us, and at the time we were kids, we were just balking at it. He would take us to New Hope and Lambertville. Every year we would drive out to New Hope and Lambertville. As a kid, I didn't appreciate it at the time. As I got older, I started to see the advantages of experiencing other places, being around other people, getting out of my segregated neighborhood and experience other cultures that I had exposure to prior to this. And so there was an annual trip. And because we had a sense of that the town was safe, that we could walk across the bridge and not feel threatened because of the color of our skin, and not feel threatened by being looked at and viewed as others. As an adult, I raised my kids going to Lambertville. As an adult, I visit Lambertville every year, 3-4 times a year. One of my favorite restaurants is the Lambertville station there. I often have meetings around this work, and I tell folks, and if we're meeting in the area, I say, well, let's just meet at the Lambertville station. So I have a personal connection to Lambertville. I grew up visiting it. The first time I took my wife to the White House, we stopped in a vintage clothing store there in Lambertville, and I bought her a dress and took her to the White House in 2008 for the holiday party. Lambertville has a special place in my heart because it helped shape my experience about growing up and visiting towns that were outside of the city and feeling welcomed and feeling valued. To this day, my current neighbor across the street from me lived in Lambertville, and we talked about his experience. He's much younger than me, and how he loved the city, and talked about the different aspects of the downtown area versus a rural area, and a little bit more rural area parts of Lambertville. But his desire to live there, and he was able to get a start and to buy a house, eventually buy a house outside of Lambertville, back into the South Jersey area, because he couldn't afford it anymore. We talked today about the affordability of Lambertville, and had he known and had he been aware that Lambertville was building affordable housing, that he would have loved to stay in the area. So, my story is Lambertville's story, and ironically, it's a part of my childhood, it's a part of my young adulthood, it's a part of my current life, a place that I visited that my parents, and I talked to my dad today about what was so important about us visiting in that area. And he said it was a beautiful area and we felt welcome. And actually, I found out today, I call myself being being, you know, the fact that I visit Lambertville maybe 2 or 3 times a year. He said, man, I go to Lambertville 2 or 3 times a month. So, you know, let's not forget that we're talking about people. And I know it's often talked about as units, but we're talking about creating opportunities for people to live in places where they work. You know, I know how difficult it is in this environment, COVID-19, where folks are trying to figure out where they're going to live and can they afford their rent, and to know that there are going to be affordable units coming online in Lambertville, where folks who work in the Lambertville station, or a teacher, or a local teacher, or a police officer can actually afford to live in the town, is very, very important. And so I'll stop there. And just like I can't state enough the fact that my upbringing, my childhood, my young adulthood, Lambertville plays a part in that, and a part of who I am today, and giving people the opportunity to, at face value, opposed to what I see, and making stereotypes and assumptions about people. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend. I really appreciate you sharing your personal connection with Lambertville. I think a lot of folks participating, including myself, have their own stories about, you know, what they love about this city and what drew them here. So I appreciate you sort of rounding out the discussion that way. We want to have as much time as possible for questions and answers. So I know I have a couple questions, but I'm going to wait, and I want residents to have an opportunity to weigh in on that. Myself and Councilwoman Taylor are going to work on moderating the question and answer piece of this. Obviously, if we could physically be together, we'd you know, be able to have sort of a more group focused conversation. But unfortunately, with the way we have had to use technology, it'll be a little bit more of a, you know, single question asker sort of process. So I just want to go over real quick for those. I know we have some hands raised already, but for folks that have not done this before, the way to ask to put forward a question is to raise your hand in the system. And so if you are joining us by computer, if you look down at the bottom menu bar, there should be a button that says raise hand, and you can click on that, and you'll show up in a queue on our screen, and we'll go through one by one, having folks answer that question, and Councilwoman Taylor is going to handle sort of the process on that end. If you are joining us by phone, you can also raise your hand in the system. That is done by pressing *9. So if you are calling in and would like to raise your hand, press *9, and you'll receive sort of an audio prompt there. And it'll explain to you how to unmute yourself when the time is yours. So I think we'll go ahead and open it up. I see we have a couple of hands raised. So Councilwoman Taylor, do you want to manage the first person that has their hand raised here? Oh, and I'm sorry, just real quick, our city planner, Emily Goldman, is with us as well. And she'll be able to speak to some of the specific questions about Lambertville's settlement, obviously to the extent that we can share publicly. So she's with us as well. So Councilwoman Taylor, you want to have the first person ask their question?
Absolutely. I think it looks like T. Thurber. I think that might be Bart Thurber.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you very much. I first of all want to ask, so I live in Lambertville, Bart Thurber, and I really want to thank Councilwoman Taylor, Councilwoman Urbish for organizing this, and Beth McManus and Reverend Eric Dobson for your participation today. It was interesting that I also want to mention that I've read through as much as I can of the affordable housing, both the settlement agreement that was endorsed back in December 3rd, 2018, as well as the amended agreement adopted March 4th of 2020. You know, I can see that the Affordable Housing Subcommittee, that's a part of our community, has done really enormous work, and I can only imagine Emily has been a big part of that as well. One of the I just want to provide the context, especially Reverend Dobson, because you emphasize so much about people and about history. And I actually will go up and look Richard Rothstein's Color of Law book. But when Beth McManus was talking about, she talked about municipality, she talked about the Fair Share Housing Center, she talked about the developers, and she talked about the courts. There wasn't a single reference to community. And the difficulty that we are having, and I'm speaking at least for my wife and me, not beyond that, but if you actually go to Michael Boland's presentation to the judge today that was issued in advance of the hearing that'll be next week, there were 32 letters that were sent by the community members up until May 2nd. And all of them, nearly all of them, refer to the police redevelopment site, which obligates us to millions of dollars in rebuilding a police station somewhere. And I would say to all of you, and I think you know this, I don't know that you're going to find a community that is more committed and more willing to participate in constructive engagement with addressing these important issues. And we feel very, very committed to it. But in the process in which community, there are no agendas, no minutes, no public transparency. And the only way I think that we all can agree to build trust is through transparency of decision-making process. Perhaps this is because it's a legal issue, not a legislative issue, if I understand correctly. But you have to, I think this is part of the frustration that so much that has been expressed in so many meetings of late. We first heard about this during the mayor's State of the City address on January 31st. The next day, there was a community development fair, but it was a very, very tiny part of that by all records. Unfortunately, I personally was not able to attend. So that was 14 weeks ago. So as of next week, we are going to be committed to dedicating the redevelopment site of the police station and compliance will be extended according to the recommendation by the special master, but we have no say whatsoever in this process. And that's really what's hardest for us to imagine, since we're so committed to the goals here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Thurber. Beth, could you just speak? I don't think it's going to do much to alleviate the frustration of our neighbors, but if you could just explain how the legal process functions generally, and some of the similar frustration you've seen play out in other places.
Yeah, I started to talk a little bit about this during the presentation, but because unlike the former process when municipalities were able to work with the state agency, this is a litigation process. And so as a result, and it's a mediation process. And so as a result, what we have are confidentiality rules regarding mediation where individual parties are unable to share specific information from those settlement discussions or those mediations with other parties, or in this case, the city is unable to share the confidential discussions with Fair Share Housing Center or with developers, with the public at large. It's just, unfortunately, it's the very nature of the process that New Jersey towns find themselves in. And unfortunately, the reality is that that's something that has caused turmoil in municipalities across the state. Just about any town that has an engaged public has had to face concerns with having negotiations shrouded in secrecy. Folks feel that there's a lack of transparency. And to be honest, there is a lack of transparency. In a perfect world, the city government would be able to go to its people, hold public meetings about each aspect of the settlement talks, but it's simply not permitted as part of this process. And it's something that every town has struggled with. So I wish I had a better answer. I wish I had a better alternative that Lambertville should have, could have, or could in the future implement. But all I can say is the city is not alone. It's something that every municipality and their public, their residents have had to struggle with.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, Reverend Dobson, is there anything you want to add to that from the fair share perspective?
No, only thing I would say is that this is how the courts made that decision. So that it has nothing to do with us. I mean, our role is to help towns become compliant with the law. And so the good thing that came out of this, I mean, I think we had a reputation before this process that we were non-negotiable. Now over 300 towns have negotiated with us, and it's like, oh wow, you guys are pretty cool. We all have the same goals, and so we're not, we're not the big bad wolf. We've changed. We've talked with towns, and they've reviewed their plans and changed them from time to time, and if that makes sense, that that's a fair way to do it, absolutely. So we're in lockstep with the community and with the town administrators. We're going to do what's best to make this work.
Thank you. Matthew Hansen, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Matthew Hansen, 105 Douglas. I just want to thank Councilwoman Urbish and everyone for putting this on this evening. It's great to learn a little bit more about affordable housing and learn more about our processes. I guess my question is a little more, I don't know if this was discussed earlier, so I do apologize. I joined a little late. Why was our affordable housing agreement not okay before, and why was it reopened? And why are we going through this process now?
Emily, you want to take that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Sure. So the initial settlement agreement included the condemnation of the Academy Hill site, which is the former high school site. And basically, as soon as the city started to move forward with the process, as soon as the city adopted that settlement agreement, the property owner of that site started filing litigation suits against the city. There have been a number of these suits filed since May of 2018. And our compliance process was stalled because of all this litigation. So we were at the point where the city was going to be required to spend millions of dollars to acquire this property, as well as, and which we couldn't, given the city's financial situation, is kind of a daunting thing to think about at the moment. As well as with all the litigation suits against the city, we couldn't actually move forward with that and finish our compliance, the compliance portion of getting to our final judgment. So with that in mind, to try to remove the condemnation aspect of that, as well as because the city was not able to adopt the overlay that was identified on the Clausen homestead, which is where the historic, the Washington headquarters house is located. We also had to find replacements for that. We wouldn't have been able to get a final judgment until we were able to replace that site in our settlement agreement as well. So that is ultimately, those are the two reasons why we had to get a new settlement agreement.
Great. And so I just want to say again, thank you to everyone. I think that I just want to speak again that affordable housing is so important. Inclusion of people in Lambertville and New Hope and this community is so important. That's who we are. But wouldn't any new agreement also bring new litigation as well and bring the open door of new lawsuits as well?
I think that's an interesting question. Obviously, we can't predict what anyone will do at any given time. So I think the litigation that the city had brought against it by the property owner of the old high school site is pretty specific to the approach that was taken there, and a pretty stark reaction to that. We don't at the moment have any indication of a similar type action that someone would want to take on the current settlement. But Beth, I don't know if you have experience with other municipalities that have had similar types of actions brought against them with their settlement agreements?
Yeah.
Beth, before you answer, I'm sorry, one sec. I just want to point out that the legal actions around the Academy Hill site, some were specific to the affordable housing, but there have been legal actions going on around that site for 20 years. Is that right, Emily?
Yeah, 20 plus years.
It's been a very litigious situation, and suits that would arise at this juncture around the plan that we're moving ahead with right now. There are no property owners that would be in the same position to do that. So I'll stop there and let Beth carry on.
So in terms of litigation that's similar to what the city's experiencing, I don't know that I have an example because the litigation that you guys have is so site specific, so specific to the individual parties. But I will say that condemnation redevelopment areas typically attract more litigation than non-condemnation redevelopment areas, just because there's so much more risk to the property owner. But also the other thing I tell communities is anybody can sue at any point for any reason whatsoever. Just because you sue doesn't mean it's valid. But the one thing that you can do is make sure that you position yourself with the least vulnerability possible and try to focus so that you can sort of pick your battles, limit your litigation vulnerability to the extent possible. And also so that you can focus on those things that are most important to you, perhaps those lawsuits that are most important to you. And that may be what Lambertville did, but I don't want to weigh into your litigation strategy just because I wasn't involved with that.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone this evening and doing this again. And I really appreciate that my questions weren't cut off and I was able to ask them this evening. It's really important to me that we really go through this process of public community and understand what's happening. And I really think this is a great step in that process. I just hope that we understand where we're going in the future. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Paul Stevens, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Paul Stevens, 39 Quarry. As everybody, I'd like to thank our guests tonight for taking the time out and the organizers for putting this together. It's been very insightful. It seems like what's coming down to in the community is over 5, quote, units. And I don't know if those are, quote, set-aside units, overlay units, whatever. That's part of what I thought this was going to be about tonight. But I guess what I'm curious about is we're going forward with this plan where the police station is part of the agreement. It's potentially going to account for 5 units, I believe. What happens if in the not too distant future we find ways to come up with those same 5 units? Would the city be covered by the protected from litigation from developers so that we could pursue other units? Just what are our options? Because you're hearing a great deal about, the police station, and that seems like a very small part of our obligation, but it's the one that's causing the most agita within the community.
That's a good question, Paul. I think maybe Emily could speak a little bit to the specifics of our settlement agreement, and then Beth or Eric, if you have anything to weigh in on sort of, there's all of these different pieces, right? So there's new build and there's zoning overlays that we can do. It's pretty complicated. So I don't know who wants to take that first. Maybe if Beth or Eric could talk about sort of like the more abstract piece of this, like what it looks like sort of statewide, and then Emily could speak a little bit to this specific issue. Would that be helpful, Paul?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just sorry I couldn't be more succinct in my question.
No, I mean, nothing about this issue. Yeah, I feel like nothing about this issue is succinct, so no need to apologize.
I can take a stab first. So if between, let's say the settlement agreement is approved and between now and 2025, 5 affordable units come to be in some way. Ultimately, what I would suspect is the city will need to seek an amended settlement agreement and amended court approval of its housing plan in order to, I think the question is, what's the process for essentially swapping out the police station? So if there's an alternative proposal or alternative units that have been created that would potentially substitute those 5 units for the police station, the process that the city was going through now would have to be replicated, but I think it would be a much shorter process because you're not trying to amend a settlement agreement with amending how the largest site in the plan will be developed and swapping other sites. It would be limited to this one site. But the one thing I want to highlight is that notion gives me some concern, is that although there may be additional affordable units that come to be in the future and the city may want to swap out that site from its settlement agreement, a couple things. One, I don't want such ideas to lead to the city not moving forward with the police station site as required in the settlement agreement, because that could cause the city to be vulnerable in the future. So it's a little potentially dangerous to start thinking about how to swap out those units at this time. But the other thing is, one of the things that seems true about this process is the city has had a lot of struggles to get through this amended settlement agreement process, and I would be really hesitant to open the door to that again and doing it for a third time during the third round.
Yeah, and I would only add, these sites are there are different, types of development. There's new development, there's redevelopment, and then there's overlay zoning. And that overlay zoning has to be a realistic opportunity for potential development. So, if you're going to pick a site, it has to have that potential of future development for overlay zoning. So that's all I can say about that. I think, Beth, her advice is very good advice. I would leave it at that.
Paul, do you feel like that answered your question, or did you want Emily to talk about some of the specifics for us?
I guess in general, it answered my question. I guess I've heard, I'd be happy to hear what Emily has to say. Let's put it that way.
So are you interested in terms of the specifics, Paul, as to what types of projects and credits the city's seeking to take in their settlement agreement? Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Well, I mean, I guess there's not much you can add. I mean, it's the police station. It counts for 5 units towards our obligation. And
yeah, I guess the one thing I would add is, the city has been very proactive in creating affordable housing units throughout its history. This third round is the first round that the city's ever actually had a new construction obligation. But even without an obligation, the city's built, not only has the city built units for itself, but it was also, which I know this is probably going to confuse everybody more, but we were also a receiving town, an RCA receiving town. So other municipalities were able to basically give the city money to build affordable housing units for them that they take credit for.
And that is no longer that process no longer exists. So don't even worry about it too much.
We can't do that anymore. But so the city, and part of what we're taking credit for in our obligation we have a number of Habitat for Humanity family sale units. We have a supportive special needs group home in the city. We have a age-restricted 100% rental development in the city, as well as we have an accessory apartment, and we have an family rental apartment in the library as well. So as Beth was saying in her presentation, that there's some minimum and maximum requirements that the city needs to meet for its obligation. And one of those is 50% of your units have to be family rental units. So that is something that the city is severely lacking in, is family rental affordable units. So that's really what we targeted this settlement agreement. In order to be able to come to a settlement with fair shares, we needed to have either overlay zones or redevelopment plans in place that would produce these family affordable units. Sorry, family rental affordable units. And in zoning, you can't really zone for the type of tenure that the unit will be. You can't zone and just change a zoning district and specify that has to be rental units. So that's part of the reason why the city has been looking at redevelopment plans instead, because you can specify in a redevelopment plan that the units have to be the family rental units, which is what the city needs. The city has also adopted overlays on 3 parcels. The Trenton Cracker Factory building, which housed the River Horse Brewing and the Center Club Gym, as well as 2 other individual properties. And both of those are they were done in 2 different overlays. The one overlay for the 2 private properties, those properties at the moment do not have sewer and water to them. So that overlay would only be available once water and sewer were extended to those properties. And that overlay then gives them the right to build at the minimum presumptive density of 6 units per acre, so that we would be able to get affordable units from that development. The overlay at the Trenton Cracker Factory, that is more for an adaptive reuse of that existing building. It is not to tear down the building and build something new. It's really to retrofit the inside of that building to be able to convert it into apartments.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Paul.
Charlie, please go ahead.
I don't know if he's.
Oh, sorry, Charlie, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm here now. Thank you very much. Appreciate the participation of Ms. McManus and Reverend Dobson tonight. It's great to hear some outside views about what we've been doing and answer some questions. But I'm glad I got to go right after Paul, because I had the same kind of thought about the incredible amount of stress that's been put on the city for the last 5 units. And I did write to Judge Miller about that, and I spoke to that in my letter to him. I said, you know, I wish that he will understand what's been going on here and the divisive nature that's evolved from this for just these last 5 units has created so much stress in the city. And, you know, my question to him was, you know, can we somehow negotiate some other plan for the last 5 units that would eliminate the need to sell the police station and all the downstream concerns that the citizenry has about what will entail or what will ensue after that. So I just wanted to, you know, put that on the table and let Fair Share know that, you know, that you know, this is something that we would certainly appreciate some latitude on. And I fully understand that this has gone on way too long, and that Fair Share would dearly love to just you know, put this through and have it done at this point. And I think, you know, there's certain elements in the city that would like to do that as well. But I'm just I'm just going on here about, you know, what I would like to see come out of the hearing. But that aside, I do have a question, and it's historical in nature, that while you're all here, I think I can probably finally get an answer to that I can understand. And it was referenced in Boland's letter to the judge today, and it's been referenced in the city's Fair Share housing plan and all that. And it has to do with the, back some years ago, it was established that the realistic development potential in Lambertville was 41 units. But the settlement agreement acknowledged on an agreed to realistic development potential of 88 units, which is more than double what that was, to allow the city to capture additional rental bonuses and credits for existing age-related units. I can't wrap my head around what that's all about. And I know Emily, you're laughing because you probably said this so many times. But
it is very confusing.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so when doing the vacant land analysis, you're right. The calculated realistic development potential out of that is the 41 units. But again, as I just said, Lambertville's been extremely proactive in actually creating units. The only thing that we're really lacking are those family rental units. So if we were to just settle with the 41 units as our RDP, we almost would be losing out on credits that we have for existing units, because as Beth also mentioned, there's these a cap for the amount of age restricted units you can take credit for. So that cap is 25% of your obligation. So the city, is part of the Heritage Village development, which is that age restricted apartment building. There's 86 total units up there. Again, the city only gets credit for 37 of those, because the other ones are part of the, you know, the other towns get the credits for the other ones. But so for those 37 units, at a RDP of 41, we're allowed 25% of those to be age restricted. So we would only be able to take credit.
RDP?
RDP is that the realistic development potential. Did I say that? Did I misspeak or something? Sorry.
No, you just said RDP, and I just want to keep it, the jargon gets overwhelming for people.
Sorry. Okay. The realistic development potential. So with at 41, we would only have been able to use 10 of those existing units. And then the same thing with the remaining unmet need, it's still capped at that 25% for the unmet need. So we really would not have been able to utilize as many of the units that we have in this existing facility. So it was really stressed. The prior courtmaster, we had a different courtmaster before Mr. Bolin, who had since retired, but she really pushed the city to agree to this higher realistic development potential. So really to help the city and help them take advantage of these existing credits. Because the other thing is if we accepted just that agreed upon, or the calculated realistic development potential of 41, our unmet need would have been much higher, and we would have needed to adopt many more overlay zones to create those realistic opportunities for affordable units. Yes, Beth.
And one other thing, so first I agree with everything Emily just said, but I just want to highlight that part of your settlement agreement, I think, is the best part. It is something that is such a huge advantage to the city that only a couple of municipalities have, frankly, had the opportunity to create for themselves. So one of the things, it does everything that Emily said. It allows you guys to utilize additional credits. It shrinks your unmet need. What it also does is it gives you guys the automatic ability to satisfy an increased realistic development potential. So if that number increases over the next several years from redevelopment, what that means is you have automatically affordable units that will address that affordable housing obligation. There are a ton of vacant land communities across the state that have an RDP of, let's say, 41 units. And if a site redevelops in the future, if they don't get any affordable housing out of it, all of a sudden their RDP could go up to 41 plus, say it goes to 50 units. And so automatically the town has got a 9-unit deficit that it's got to satisfy. So it's got to create more mechanisms at some point in order to meet that increased RDP. But here in Lambertville, you guys have 47 units that you can pull, 47 credits that you can automatically pull to meet any increased RDP. And so that is going to reduce stress, and it's going to reduce problems in the future as the city may potentially redevelop in the future. So that is, in my mind, that is the biggest advantage that the city has eked out for itself in its settlement agreement.
I think if I understand this right, the negotiation to increase the amount of the realistic development potential worked out for Lambertville because of the component analysis of all the different parts that go into the puzzle, right? So the rental units, the family units, et cetera, right? So we actually wound up in a more favorable position with a higher number. But Beth just elicited another question in my mind about future use and future realistic development potential. What factors would increase our RDP in the future?
I had to address this last night actually at the planning board meeting. I had the same question. So it's basically if there's any future redevelopment in the city that would change the use of that property from its existing use. That's basically right. That's basically what would make us recalculate that realistic development potential.
Yeah.
Any new developments that come along would increase the realistic development potential, but I assume that the city would also have a component of that that would say, if you're going to develop this plot of land with X amount of units, 20% of that or some percent of that has to be affordable. So
Yeah, and
it
Charlie,
doesn't-
part of our settlement agreement included a stipulation that the city have to adopt a mandatory set-aside ordinance. And so that, which the city did in November of 2018, and that ordinance states that if the city, through any rezoning, use variance, density variance, redevelopment plan, or rehabilitation plan, if that results at 5 units or more at a density of 6 units or more per acre, they automatically have to have a affordable housing set aside. So pretty much any sort of, redevelopment in that method in the future would be required to provide those affordable units.
And this surplus allows you guys to do non-residential redevelopment. That's possible that the, the CVS or the Valparaiso sites get redeveloped with non-residential use. Those sites could still generate an RDP depending on the particulars of the redevelopment. And if it does, the city's covered because you have the 47 units of surplus credits.
All right, I think I have a clearer understanding of that now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. I have a question on that. I'm sorry. So I don't think I understood this properly. Even non-residential development, will increase our RDP?
It can.
It can.
It's a very site-specific circumstance, but it could. And there are going to be towns that contend with that in the future, as especially if it's a great site for residential housing and they require that it only be redeveloped non-residentially. There's going to be municipalities that generate RDP on non-residential sites, and Lambertville may too, but the fundamental difference is that you guys are protected.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, on to Judy, please go ahead. You can
hi, this is Judy Gleason, 86 North Union Street. First of all, I want to thank everybody for doing this. Of course, this is useful, although I will say that much of our discussion of fair share housing is it sort of belies all the things we've already done. So I'm going to jump right ahead to the settlement agreement that we had before and the amendment to the settlement agreement that we have before us. And I'm also going to say that the discussion earlier that mentioned the fact that it was unfortunate that this process is kind of shrouded in secrecy. And of course, I would agree with that. But I have to say, and I have to remind us that Fair Share Housing has, the executive director has taken the time to put online their view on some of the things that have recently gone on, which led to the amendment, which many of us are deeply concerned about. This amendment, I will note before I say the Fair Share Housing part, this amendment stepped up to where the Clausen property was no longer available. And this amendment basically put in the police site. So the point made earlier, quite well, the 5 units that we're fighting over that everybody's freaked out about, let's not forget what we're talking about. But Fair Share Housing pointed out in their statement that the WIMAC and Napa Auto sites there was so much pushback from the city. Well, many of us in the city don't know of the pushback on the WIMAC site. We don't actually know and can't find what the pushback was, but there was apparently pushback that nobody knows about. And that is of concern to us because we see the WIMAC site coming before the planning board very soon with like 9 units of housing and no necessity of dealing with affordable housing, which is troubling and not entirely understood by me. So looking through these things and seeing what we have not gotten on this whole discussion is, how is it that the city, when faced with things that Fair Share Housing was saying they would accept, we said, oh, there's a pushback from the citizenry, so we're going to have to move to the police department site. And we know in the city, because we went to the state of the city address, and we went to the development fair, and we know that where the city administration is trying to go is, hey, here's an idea. We can take affordable housing and then go shooting towards a lot of other things. So those are the things that many of us had hoped would also be included in the educational piece that we're getting tonight. And I don't minimize the importance of the educational piece that we are getting, but I'm wishing that we had more information on other elements that would not have had to say no Clausen property and therefore police station site. So I don't know what that means, and I don't know if you can explain any of it, but if you can, that would be great.
Sure, Judy, I think we can try to get to some of that at the very least. I mean, I will say, in terms of reference to community development, that I hope that we've been clear this next year, so that the remainder of this year is going to be focused on sort of studying the issue, gathering information, and having a community-wide dialogue. I actually just had someone today send me a report that was put out on sort of best practices for like charrette style meetings in the virtual age right now that we're living in. So I'm looking forward to sort of digging through that and trying to pull some ideas out, but certainly understand the concern there. I think it might be helpful for Emily to talk a little bit about the public meetings that were had about the sites that were referenced by Adam, as well as, have been referenced by the mayor previously that were considered but taken off the table. I think there's differences for sort of each one. Some is public pushback, some is the property owner pulling out of negotiations. So if it would be helpful, I think Emily could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So, as you may or may not recall, this all kind of started in November of 2018 when we introduced the overlays on the Corboy, Bird, the Trenton Cracker Factory sites, as well as the Clausen site. And there was a lot of opposition against the overlay on the Clausen site. I think we had a 2.5-hour council meeting that night discussing it. So we went back to the drawing board. We tried to see if there was a way that we could make the Clausen site work. And there was just no way that we can get it to work. So then we started looking at other sites, and we looked at the YMAC was a site that we looked at. We looked at the Finkel's warehouse site. We looked at the Napa Auto Parts site. We were trying to negotiate with the owners of the CVS lot site to see if they would be interested in redeveloping their lot to provide some affordable housing. And I know the mayor has said on multiple times it's the administration's policy that they don't want to adopt things on properties that the landowners don't want to move forward with or aren't interested in having the overlay zoning or redevelopment plans or whatnot on them. So with the CVS site, the owner was not interested whatsoever. So we moved on from that. The auto parts site, we had I should say the night we were introducing, it was going to be the auto parts site and the Finkel's warehouse site. That night, it was pretty soon after the 14 Lambert Lane applications occurred at the planning board level, which also was a lot owned by Mrs. Finkel. So based on her, based on the act, her feelings after that planning board meeting, she just wasn't emotionally ready to do anything else and be part of like a large fight like this again in the public meetings. So she asked to be removed from the overlay for the Finkel's warehouse site. The auto parts site, there was another, a 2-hour meeting about that site that ended in council rescinding the overlay. There was a couple public, to my understanding, there was a couple of meetings with the neighbors and the developer after that to see if there was some sort of consensus that could be made, which, you know, I think after that, it's my understanding that the developer is now just moving forward with a as of right development. And it is the same developer of the auto parts store, is the same developer for the YMAC lot. And after the experience with the auto parts lot, he was not interested in furthering any negotiations with the city. We were negotiating with him for about 6 months as to what we could do for the YMAC site and how we can get affordable housing there. And after his experience with the auto parts site, he chose not to engage in those negotiations anymore.
Adam, am I still on or?
Yep, you're still on.
Okay. I'm just trying to, I was involved with a lot of that stuff, so I'm familiar with it. I was around with many of the issues, and I guess I don't always know the extent to which a single developer is the only option that we have, and maybe that's because we only have 1 or 2 sites and this developer owns them. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Judy.
That's okay.
You know, being a town that really doesn't have vacant land, you know, again, hence the vacant land analysis that we did, it's been a struggle to identify sites that we could even put these overlays on. So I think, you know, what happened is with the auto parts site and what would have happened if Finkel's decided to move forward, you know, I think the feeling is with these overlays, it really would have, it was lots of these little overlays that would have resulted in 1 unit. So with a lot of, you need the density in order to get the unit. And I think there was overall the thought processes with all of the you know, the pushback that was seen for these little smaller overlays, that the city took a step back to look at how can we resolve this where we don't have to have these smaller overlays that would only result in 1 unit in each of the overlays.
And I think an important piece to just note here too is we've heard from a lot of residents that the concern was the density part of these plans. And it's a little bit complicated, and I confess that I don't fully understand all of this, but you know, there are as a developer, to financially make a project make sense, there have to be so many sort of rental units within a property to make an affordable one make sense. I know, Beth, you have explained this to me in a way that I found helpful. So if there's a question on that, I think Beth might be able to explain it more. But, you know, the concern was really on the density piece of these development potentials for affordable, and not necessarily the affordable unit itself.
Right. So just the last thing I will say, because I'm sure there's other people with questions, but so the YMAC development that's currently under consideration does not have, the city has not, there's no requirement for somebody who puts forth a development of that size. There's no requirement for them to say anything or look at anything about affordable anything, because they don't have to.
So
right?
Judy, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off again.
No. Good.
So again, that mandatory set aside ordinance only kicks in if there's a rezoning, a use variance, density variance, redevelopment plan, or rehabilitation plan. So the city was trying to work with them to get a rehabilitation plan for that site. So then that mandatory set aside would have kicked in. Instead, the developer is choosing to just use the underlining R2 zoning, and he's proposing a development that's an as of right development based on the existing R2 zoning. So because of that, we can't force him to do affordable housing, but instead the city has a development fee. So he will have to pay a 1.5% of the equalized assessed value of each of those units that get developed. And that goes into the housing trust fund that can then fund other affordable housing projects.
Right. So I will bow out, knowing that what will happen is the fairness hearing, which appears to be pretty much on its way, and then we will not really have much in the way of an opportunity, we meaning non-officials in town, won't really have much in the way of any opportunity to do anything, because other than the budget, which we would have to be spending money on all this stuff, which we also don't have any control over, there's really no options out there from what I hear you guys saying for the citizens of the town to resist or delay or try to get attention to other aspects. Am I understanding that properly?
I mean, Judy, that's a tough question to answer, and I want to answer it honestly. I think we are in a position where we have an agreement that we need to move forward. If we do not move it forward, we put ourselves at risk for builder's remedy. That said, we have tried, and we hope it looks promising that we will have until December to create the redevelopment plan for the police site, which means there will be lots of time for public input about what that ultimate development looks like and how it functions on the site. So yes, there will be public input, but as of this moment, we're obligated to move ahead with this plan. It doesn't mean the public can't have input and that we don't hear it. I think it's maybe a risky thing to say, but we're all in this together. We hear you, but we also have the responsibility to make sure we don't open ourselves up to a lawsuit that could cost millions of dollars. Well, millions is probably an overstatement, but tens of thousands of dollars, slow everything down. It's really a difficult position, but we hear you loud and clear.
Well, I'm sorry, I said I was done, but I actually am not. There's one last point. Obviously, and the Fair Share Housing noted that the police station site would require the location of the police station, no reasonable realistic timetable. We're not really in position on that, and we're not really in a good financial position this year on that. And I don't want to overlook the fact that many of the people in town would like to say, this is not the year to be spending money, folks. It's really not. And some of the things that we need to do for affordable housing, we're not under the same sort of gun that has been said, meaning we've done lots of things, we'll still do things. Whether we can tie the bow on the last couple of units or not, I don't know, but this is a big cash outlay direction, and there's a lot of concern about that, which, we'll see what happens. But I realized I needed to make that point because of the kind of costs associated with this approach, because the settlement amendment that was put in a work session on February 2nd is an amendment which the city came up with. So they're not really up against any problem that they didn't create. The administration came up with that. So we're concerned about what it's going to cost us. But anyway, I will stop. I appreciate your listening, your responding, and I appreciate what you've done to put this together, and I will bow out. So thank you.
Well, thank
Thanks,
you, Judy.
Maddy, before you go on to the time check, I just want to let you do the time check in just a second, but I think it would be useful for maybe Beth, since she's not been involved in all this, but has seen how it plays out, or even if Reverend Dobson has some input. It's hard to argue with what Judy says, that we put ourselves in this position, but there are carryovers from the previous agreement, which we did not vote for. We did not develop. Well, some of us didn't develop anyway. There are carryovers from that influenced how we had to move ahead. So is there some sort of generalized conversation about that, Beth, that you could provide to help clarify? Or, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I feel like that's my role here, is to be put on the spot, so that's okay. So in general, I've seen both agreements, and I don't want to comment, in part because I just don't have the expertise on the particulars of it, but I will say I see your amended settlement agreement as sort of the natural consequence for seeking an amendment. You can see a lot of similarities between the two agreements in terms of the terms that the city agreed to, the terms that Fair Share agreed to. And there are a number of things that have been continued across both agreements. Obviously, some of the sites have been continued, but in order to I presume in order to incentivize Fair Share Housing Center into going through a new settlement agreement process with the city, there were certain parts that needed to be carried over. And in part, that includes the number of affordable units, the requirement that is all of the components be addressed, some of the implementation schedule for moving sites forward in terms of adoption of zoning and getting sites out to the public, things like that. I really see this as what I would have expected as the natural consequence of seeking an amended settlement agreement, you know, aside from the particulars, because that's really municipal specific.
Thanks, Beth. And I would also just say on the cost side of things, you know, we are certainly aware that folks, I mean, we are hyper focused on trying to reduce costs. That's one of the reasons why we moved away from condemnation, because it would have cost the city millions of dollars. And, you know, we're trying to look at solutions to affordable housing, but ones that are also taking into consideration you know, redevelopment opportunities that will also create new ratables for the city and actually, you know, reduce overall tax impact by sort of spreading costs out among a wider base. But that is for another night for our budget discussion, which we'll be having at our June council meeting. Just before we move on to the next person, I want to do a quick time check. Unfortunately, we only have our panelists until 9 p.m. tonight. So we are going to have to close the meeting at 9 o'clock. We are going to do our best to get to all of the questions before that time. But I will say if we aren't able to get to your question before the end, you can email myself, Councilwoman Urbish at lambertvillenj.org, or Councilwoman Taylor, which is Councilwoman Taylor at lambertvillenj.org. And we will do our best to coordinate with Beth, Eric, and Emily on getting you a response. We are also open to having another one of these. I think it's a really great discussion that needs to continue to be had. We wanted to make sure we got this one in before the May 12th court hearing. And so, you know, we're more than happy to schedule another one of these after that hearing. And if folks have recommendations on sort of format, what worked well with this, what didn't work well, and suggestions on how to improve it, we would love to hear those as well. So I will stop talking so we can get to the next question. The one other thing I'll just say is I think we're going to try to prioritize folks that haven't had a chance to speak or ask a question first. And then as long as we're able to get through all of those, then we'll also start going through sort of the repeat hand raisers. So.
Thank you. And Reverend Dobson, looked like you maybe wanted to chime in.
I was, but I'll hold it too, because I want to get as many questions we can get in. So I'll comment in later.
Are you sure?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Sue, please go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Sue Bell. I live at 407 Surgeon Drive. Thank you, Reverend Dobson and Beth McManus, for being here tonight. I really appreciate all your input and all your hard work on this issue. I just sort of wanted to comment about the pilot program and the fact that doing this, you said you walked away, and this is not, I am absolutely not opposed to affordable housing. I told you guys I was a transitional housing caseworker in the past. What I am concerned about is offering someone, you said you walked away because Mrs. Finkel became uncomfortable, so you have a developer now that you're going to give a 30-year pilot program, which is no taxes. So that's not a rateable issue. And that really, really sort of bothers me. I feel like we're selling our future for that, because the amount of apartments, wait, Emily, it is going to have an impact on the school. It's not just the city, it's the school, and our school needs work too. So I don't want to be, we've heard a lot about the debt and the cost of the debt. I don't really see that this is a whole lot different. I know it is different, but because she became uncomfortable, you removed the overlay. You're now, there is money, you know, through the good news is Governor Murphy did create the affordable trust, a housing trust fund this year out of real estate taxes. And there is some capital incentive plans and tax things. So we could potentially have a developer come into the town now with using all public funds to build a building that we're then giving him 30 years of not having to pay taxes on while he creates rents each year. And I'm not saying he is, I don't know that. But there is, the good news is there is some capital development for affordable housing now. So.
I think that's
It sounds like 30 years of not taking taxes is a whole lot more money than we might have to pay for litigation. That's where I'm coming from.
Sure, Sue. I think that's a great point. And I know that there's concerns about the idea of the pilot. So Emily, I know that you had your hand raised and you wanted to respond.
Yeah, so a redevelopment plan gives the city the opportunity to negotiate over a pilot. It doesn't mean that it 100% has to permit a pilot or approve a pilot. And again, you know, the city is looking for redevelopment more so it can specify that those units that we receive are those family rental affordable units, which is what the city really needs. And it also allows us to specify that it has to be a 20% set aside versus the standard 15% set aside for a rental unit. So, you know, I know the concern is that there's automatically a pilot that would then be part of this project, and that's not necessarily the case.
And can you speak to also what the terms of pilots are? Because I want to clarify the misunderstanding that pilots equal no taxes and for 30 years.
Yeah, so a pilot is basically, it's a payment in lieu of taxes. So it's, they're still paying a substantial amount to the city on an annual basis. It's, you know, it's 5% of whatever that agreed upon payment is goes to the county, and the rest of it basically goes to the city. I think, and again, this is more of a legal issue. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure, but I think the city can elect to have a portion of that go to the school district. I'm not 100%.
Yes. I can negotiate with the school to make sure that the school will benefit from redevelopment. And I think it's important to know, we understand the concerns about the school, and this is all theoretical, but just in terms of what the process could be, if nothing happens, the school gets what it's getting today. If something happens, it gets more than it's getting today. And we can negotiate to try to make that benefit both parties.
Thank you.
Okay,
I said thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Okay.
Kieran, please go ahead.
Yes, this is Tom Schwartz. Kieran is here with me. I have a couple of questions. One for Emily. Am I correct that there's nothing, and perhaps Elizabeth, there's nothing in the confidentiality of the negotiation process that prohibits a city from polling its citizens or communicating with its citizens about potential sites without regard to whether they're under discussion to get community feedback on those sites? Is that correct?
Beth, I'll let you go first.
Oh, thank you. If there are sites that are owned by developers and developer interveners, then yes, I whether it's legally prohibited.
I'm not talking about developers or developer interveners, just generally sites. In other words,
Just general sites. I don't think there's anything prohibiting the city from doing outreach about potential sites for development, but when it gets into the details of how those sites might be specifically addressed in the settlement agreement with fair share,
I understand.
That might be a bit.
Yes, I understand it. Thank you. But
Okay.
and one question I have for Reverend Dobson, given the history in this country of starting with the Native Americans, where we gave them the worst land as their reservations, do you think it's appropriate for affordable housing to be built in a flood zone under high tension wires?
You know, that I'm not sure what specific development you're talking about, so I can't.
I'm talking about the police station.
That's something that, you know, the specific sites are not so much our expertise. It's just really the town itself knows, knows the town better than we do. So we really rely on the town to choose these sites that has that potential development. And again, our goal is to assist the towns in making those decisions and working with Beth and working with other folks in the planning department to see what's a potential redevelopment site. And the environmental issues are taken into consideration in every site. And those things are worked out with those experts who have the expertise in that. So.
Okay, so you gave us a very interesting and frankly persuasive introduction before about growing up and crossing the bridge. And I'm asking you, Reverend, do you believe it's appropriate to put affordable housing under high tension wires near in a flood zone?
Again, that is, that is a discussion that happens within your town. I'm not familiar with that specific site, but there is, let me say this, there is no site that will be developed without the environmental concerns, without all those issues being addressed. It just can't be. So whatever has to be mitigated for a site to be developed, it has to comply with zoning, with planning, with environmental issues. So nothing can be developed if those environmental issues aren't addressed. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you.
And I do just want to point out the entire site is not within the flood hazard area. There's a portion, the existing improved portion of the site is not within the flood hazard area.
But the entire site is under the high tension wires or nearby within the number of feet that studies in Europe have shown causes childhood leukemia to increase.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Judy DeTrano, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm just trying to educate myself, so I hope anyone who's listening will forgive me for my naivete. I have a couple of questions. Emily, when you talk about family friendly, is that the same as affordable housing, or is there a difference? Is one question. I have a couple. Do you want me to go one by one, or do you want to respond?
I can just quickly respond to this one. I was trying to say family rental affordable units. So they're all affordable units, but what we really need are the family rental kinds.
So is family rental different than the affordable housing obligation?
Yeah, so the affordable housing obligation, I think, as Beth explained, we have some requirements to meet as part of that. So, we have to have at a minimum 25% of those units have to be rental units.
Yeah.
Half of which of those have to be family rentals. 50% of the entire obligation have to be family units. And no more than 25% of the obligation is allowed to be age-restricted units. So,
Emily, can you just explain what family means? We're talking about bedroom, we're talking about size, and I think we haven't specified that.
Oh, so family, so basically it's family are the non-age restricted units. When we say family in the affordable housing world, it means they're not the age restricted units. So there's either age restricted or non-age restricted, and generally that's what we just call family units.
So affordable housing is not in and of itself age restricted. It's financial, economic income.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about the incomes. Yep.
The second question I have, because I do have three, if that's okay. Actually, by the way, Eric Dobson, thank you very much. Your presentation was very much appreciated, and your responses are very much appreciated. Thank you. All of you are appreciated. But so the second question I have is, has the city of Lambertville done or has available properties for development, not necessarily in the central part of Lambertville City? Well, I mean, of course, it's in the city of Lambertville, but up on 518, up on the hills, over near the Suez water supply in that area. And who does the evaluation as to which properties might be available? That would be second. But part of that question is there legally, are we able to contact nonprofit organizations who might be willing to develop properties that are 100% affordable housing? Are we restricted to have it be a combination, or could we in fact build something that is 100% affordable housing?
Sure. So there's kind of two parts to that question. So I'll answer the second part first, because I think that's the easier one to answer, is if we can just do 100% affordable. And the city actually already has 3 age-restricted 100% affordable projects within the city. Hibernia Apartments and South Hunterdon Apartments are both age-restricted affordable units. They were built pre-1980, so the city doesn't actually receive any credit for them as part of their affordable housing obligation. But Heritage Village is also one of these 100% affordable jobs. The thing with 100% affordable jobs is that they definitely are built. They're being built all over the state, but there's most of the developers, I think all of the developers pretty much need tax credit funding in order to build them. And every year there's currently every year there's cycles to apply for 9% tax credits from the state. But very few of them actually get awarded each year because there's really not that much money available to fund these projects. So it's a very difficult and competitive process in order to get that tax funding. Oftentimes you'll have, let's say 6 projects that all score 100% in terms of the rating system, and the tiebreakers that get the 1 or 2 projects to actually get the tax credits is based on how much money will the municipality then put into that project to help reduce the amount of tax credits needed. So it's an extremely competitive process and very difficult. And it's really projects that are receiving these tax credits are 80+ units. And, there's really kind of getting to
a density issue, right?
A density issue, and then again, it's that lack of available land in the city, which kind of gets to the second question of, is there land kind of up on the hills, I think is what you're getting at.
Yes.
And so one of the overlays is up on the hills, kind of up 518, kind of near the Heritage Village area. Another one is down near the Public Works facility in the Quarry Street area, and then the Trenton Cracker Factory. And part of that vacant land analysis that's done is you look at all of the vacant land within the city, and then once you identify all of that land, you identify the constraints on those lands, whether it's steep slopes, wetlands, flood hazard areas, and you have to subtract out that constrained portion of those properties. So, and then with that, what's called then the net acreage that's left after you subtract out that constrained portion, you multiply that by, up on the hills, we use the standard presumptive density of the 6 units per acre, which is right in the directions on how to do the vacant land analysis that you have to use. If you multiply that remaining acreage by the 6 units per acre, and you result in a certain number of units. If you multiply those certain units by the 20% set aside, and it results in 1 affordable unit, that's what goes into your RDP. And that's ultimately a site that could then, you could put an overlay on that would produce a unit. So the city, in coming up and suggesting the overlays that it did in the initial settlement agreement, that's exactly what they did, is they looked at those properties in that vacant land analysis to see what would actually result in producing units. So while there's small pieces of vacant land up in the hills areas, none of them, the rest of them didn't result in the production of affordable units.
Understood. If I may continue, Emily, who is it that assesses or searches out properties that might have an availability or possibility for redevelopment of one sort or another?
In general, or are you saying, if any redevelopment occurs?
In general.
Most often are not redevelopment, unless unless the municipality is really willing to do condemnation. Most of it occurs in connection with a willing developer, willing landowner.
Understood. So if I may, in conclusion, just make a comment that I would have hoped that one of you might have responded to Mr. Schwartz, that a good portion of the residential homes in Lambertville are in a flood zone. It's just part and parcel of living right by the river. But of course, we also have the issue of 5G, which I believe is a separate issue in terms of any development that's near any of the power stations. But in regards to the flood zone, it's just part of Lambertville. But thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Judy. Emily, so I just want to clarify one thing because I misspoke earlier because I'm learning along with everyone else. So family units, that all that means is not age restricted. There's nothing about the size, number of
Correct.
bedrooms.
Yeah, it's just the non-age restricted units.
Okay, thank you. We're getting close to time. We have several hands up, but Eric, you had a comment you wanted to make. I don't want to miss that. So if you would like to share what you had to say.
No, I was just going to only say, like, I know there's some concerns about public participation, and I think it's important for the public not to disengage after this process has come to a culmination, and then you're starting to review development plans with the developer. And sometimes people disengage, and the very structure of what that development looks like is left to the developer to build things that are just totally, how can I say this, doesn't fit the neighborhood. Does that make sense? So I think for all of you who are concerned about public participation, please don't disengage after this process, because you have a stake in saying, okay, we want to use this type, the developer, we want to use this type of brick, you want to use that type of facing, long as it fits in with the, really the developer's margins of what he's able to do or she's able to do. There's a lot of development that happens in towns like Lambertville that you can definitely see doesn't fit, where there are other towns who are engaged in it, where new development looks just like old development. Does that make sense? So there is part of public participation that you need to engage in. There are some affordable housing developers who are much better at it than others, who the units looks like affordable units were up. So I just want to encourage you, don't disengage in this process, because it is very vital for the structure of the aesthetics and the spaces, the architecture of your community, of your town, to look like it looks. And that's where the public can have a stake in. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. And I know the city is working on creating this community advisory team to help shepherd that, and we intend to have the public very much involved in kind of some design discussions before we even develop the redevelopment plan for this site. So we're definitely very much planning on having a lot of public communications about this.
Yeah, because if I come to Lambertville and I see something that's totally out of whack, I'm going to be devastated. I've been coming here since I was a kid. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I hear you.
Thank you. Okay, Audrey. Okay, this is going to be difficult. Let's see. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. So, Audrey, you are now a panelist because you have an older version of Zoom. So it's the only way I could get you on here. So please go ahead with your question.
Thanks. Yeah, this happened last time too, so I have to update. Thank you for holding this meeting. This is great, very informative. Some of my question was already kind of touched on, but it kind of, I kind of wonder, like, what happens? There's been so many properties rattled off. Finkel site, the Hill site, a lot of properties that just can't be developed for some reason or other. So at what point do we run out of space, and do we ever meet a cap? So like what happens in 2025, I guess, when our agreement has to be redone? Do we ever meet a cap, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, so, you know, as a vacant land town, that's always a concern, and it's basically moving forward. We're gonna have to look towards either redevelopment or figuring out more overlay zoning to create that realistic potential. And, you know, so come 2025 and whenever this fourth round gets started and we have to start working on the next round, we'll be having all of these discussions all over again, probably.
Hey, Beth, are there other municipalities that are kind of facing a similar predicament?
I was just going to say that's a question for a lot of vacant land towns around the state, and it's a question that I can't answer. I think it's something that we're going to sort of collectively as a state have to figure out in the third round, because there are going to be communities like Lambertville and other communities that are all or just about entirely built out that have already extracted the remaining capacity out of their town through overlay zoning, municipally sponsored sites, etc. And there's going to be a fourth round obligation. There's going to have to be a collective discussion with, I mean, if we're still in this situation, with the courts, with Fair Share Housing Center as to how to move forward, or if the state ever gets its act together with the Council on Affordable Housing. But to some extent, that's unfortunately a bit of an unknown, what's going to happen to vacant land communities. But so I wish I could give some more certainty with that. But just know that Lambertville is, you know, there are many other communities in the state that are going to be facing similar questions in 2025.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Yeah, because we are kind of running out of space. We're a small community. We're surrounded by river and hills, and all these sites have just, you know, come up as naught. So, okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
So I just want to, we are reaching our time here at 9 o'clock, and I know Reverend Dobson has actually another obligation that he has to get to and has to leave. And I know that we have more hands up and specifically 2 folks that haven't had an opportunity to ask a question yet. Reverend Dobson, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for also sort of bringing the historical context and sort of centering us on the fact that we can get lost in units and overlays and all of these very technical terms, but we're talking about people at the end of the day. So we just really appreciate you joining us and bringing that perspective to the table here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And the opportunity to be a part of the discussion with a town that I love, that I grew up visiting and continue to come back is dear to me. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what I'm going to do, if it's okay with the rest of the panelists, is I'm going to read the list of folks who are in the queue for questions right now, and then we will cut it off after that. And I will ask people to please be concise with your questions. If your questions have already been asked, please don't ask them again. And I will go, so we've got Gina Fischetti, Sandra Harris, John Franzini, and then we'll go back to Matthew, Paul, and Charlie. Okay, Dawn, you just got in under it, but that's, so we've got 7 more questions, then we're gonna have to cut it off. And we, please, if you have questions that don't get answered tonight, email them to us. We will do our best to organize another one of these if it would be helpful. But we do want to be respectful of everybody's time tonight. So let me get Gina going. Okay, Gina, go ahead, please.
Hello, good evening. Thanks a lot for doing this, guys. Really appreciate it. I have questions about two different topics. My first question revolves around the whole 5 units of unmet need. So what I'm curious about is what is the expectation for development of an unmet need site? Specifically, you know, like what is the risk for a builder's remedy over unmet need units? Because it's been mentioned a number of times that Lambertville is at risk for a builder's remedy lawsuit. But as far as I can tell, the outstanding units that we have are these 5 units of unmet need. Well, I guess 10 units, right? But we have the 5-unit accessory apartment program. So it's the 5 units on the police site going towards unmet need. So I'm curious as to what really the risk for a builder's remedy over those unmet need units are, what the expectation for development of them is, and also if there is a real risk for a builder's remedy lawsuit, you know, if there are any cases where that has happened in other municipalities. And then do you want me to ask my other question now, or should I wait?
Why don't we answer that one now, just so we don't lose anything from it? So Beth, I know that you and I actually specifically talked about this. So do you think you could speak to the builder's remedy concern?
Yeah, definitely. So I do think that Lambertville has a risk of builder's remedy, just generally, not this moment, but without that immunity from it, as currently granted by the court, and what would be continued through the judgment of repose. Without that, I do definitely think the city is at risk. And I say that because just at a very high level, it's because Lambertville is a really desirable place to live, and the housing prices command, in some cases, incredible value. And so from a developer's perspective, it is a great place to build and sell or maybe rent homes. So that's the market support for a builder's remedy. But you know, there's this common misperception across the state that municipalities without vacant land are not eligible or not a target for builder's remedy litigation. And it's just not true, quite frankly. There are cases where municipalities don't realize that they're eligible or potentially going to be targeted for a builder's remedy litigation until it's filed. And that's just a too common story where folks think that they don't have the market demand, they don't have the land, until they realize that somebody has sold their perhaps existing developed property to a developer that's savvy enough to know that they're going to get more out of the community through builder's remedy litigation than through a use variance. And one of the examples that I've given in the past and that I'll give here is it's actually a shore community, but they're just about fully developed, you know, different character than Lambertville, but they're fully developed. They were a vacant land. They ultimately became a vacant land community. But they were subjected to builder's remedy litigation on an active, occupied, fully impervious covered marina site. So this is a site that was occupied by an existing successful business, and I don't know what brought it about, whether the property owner decided to sell his land or they were approached by a developer, but quite frankly, it doesn't matter because the developer took advantage of that town's vulnerability, filed the builder's remedy, and then went through years of litigation. To be honest, in fact, that's almost more of a heartbreaking story because what ended up happening is the town spent, I don't know, maybe $750,000 trying to defend themselves, ultimately mediate with the developer during the builder's remedy litigation. The developer ultimately walked away from the site. So their money, their efforts were for nothing. They didn't even get any affordable housing out of the property. But I think that's a good example of how towns don't think they're vulnerable until somebody picks up a piece of property.
Right. No, but I guess my question specifically is about the unmet need units, right? Because we have sites addressing our RDP. And we have sites addressing most of our unmet need. It's really these, like what the angst that's going on right now is over, you know, as others have said, you know, the development of the police site, which is covering 5 units of unmet need. So you know, the threat, I guess what I'm wondering about isn't necessarily the vulnerability of a vacant land town to be sued through builder's remedy generally, but rather specifically over unmet need units.
Yeah, I do still think that that's a threat for a town like Lambertville.
But I'm confused about that. Could you
Okay.
Could you explain?
So the unmet, I think sort of what you're alluding to is unmet needs sites have, they have a little bit less of a, what's the word? I don't know, a burden applied to them. You know, RDP sites, they are, you know, they must be developed, they must be available, suitable at that moment in order to move forward. Unmet needs sites are typically things like, or oftentimes they're overlay zoning, for example. Where you're waiting for the private market to come forward and decide to develop the property. But here, I wouldn't look at this, it's not so much a question as to what happens if say the police site doesn't get developed, you know, what's our risk for unmet need? It's really, it's two things. One way to look at it is, what's the risk of the city not implementing the settlement agreement and not implementing the judge's order? And that carries significant risk. One of the things that I would expect to see in your order, the upcoming order from the judge, are requirements in place to push forward on the police station site. For example, requiring, because it's a city-owned property, requiring that the city actually move forward with redevelopment by selecting a developer, doing a redevelopers agreement, etc. And if that's not done, at that point, it's not so much the question that whether an unmet needs site has been developed, it's really a question is the city following the judge's order? And if the answer is no, then that is a huge vulnerability. And that's the type of thing that can lead to a town losing their immunity.
Sure.
But once the city follows that, you know, the city's responsible for following the court's direction and trying to seek having a redeveloper in place. After that, at that point, to some extent, it falls to the private market and having the developer push things forward. This is not a municipally sponsored site where the city's literally required to do the sticks and bricks. It's not required to build the units themselves, but it is required to push forward the site as will be set forth in the judge's order.
So I'm just gonna, just so I can parse through. I'm sorry, I just have one more follow-up question. Can I?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to get to the second question just because I want to be respectful of the other people that have their hands raised.
Oh, yeah, sure. I just want to make sure can I just make sure I understand what Beth said, because it was, so there's not a real expectation that an unmet needs site is developed.
Well,
right?
I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, ultimately, unmet need sites are expected to develop or redevelop over time, but it doesn't have the same. It doesn't have the same burden. It doesn't have the same realistic opportunity burden as an RDP site. That said, if a municipality is found to be blocking it, or if through application to the court or in the fourth round, it's been determined that the zoning on the site, that ultimately the density and the set aside on the site is inadequate for ever attracting a developer, I would expect that it to be required to be adjusted. And if the municipality refuses, then, you know, we're back to that other circumstance where the town is potentially going to be violating the judge's direction.
Sure, fair enough. If that's the decision that the town makes to zone that, then the judge issues an order. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then my second question has to do with the city's position that it will only put an overlay or zone for affordable housing a property if the owner is in favor of zoning it as such. So, you know, that seems problematic to me, because it seems to be an example of like a discriminatory practice that the Fair Housing Act is trying to prevent, right? Like if you have a property owner who says, I don't want affordable housing on my site, and the city says, okay, then we won't do it. Isn't that what the Fair Housing Act is trying to prevent? Thank you. That's my question.
I mean, perhaps I guess I see your point. If a property owner is saying, I don't want those people living on my land, that's a problem that I might agree with you about. I don't know, although I'm not sure about the legal specifics of it. But I think the bigger issue is a municipality should not be designating sites for affordable housing, for inclusionary housing specifically, where you have a property owner saying, I'm not going to do that. If it's an RDP site, it eliminates the possibility of having a realistic development, or excuse me, realistic opportunity created if you have a property owner that's saying, I'm not going to build those units that you need. I mean, similarly with the unmet needs sites, if you have property owners that have said, I'm not going to do that, then it puts the municipality in a bind, because at some point, whether it's the fourth round or part of monitoring, the core or fair share is going to ask the town, why aren't those unmet need sites moving forward? And if the answer is because we selected sites that we knew the property owners would never develop, that's a problem. And if I were a special master, I would say, well, then that suggests that you need alternative sites that might actually move forward in the future. And that really only applies where you have a developer that has explicitly said, I am not going to build that zoning, period.
Sure. And I would assume that would be even furthered, you know, if there was a municipality where unmet need sites were not developing, but other sites that were not, with no overlay, were developing without affordable housing.
Wait, what's your question? I'm sorry.
I'm just kind of, going off of what you just said, like how a judge would look at what a municipality is doing in terms of its development. If there's overlay sites addressing unmet need that aren't developing, right, with any affordable housing, with anything, but then maybe in that same municipality, which perhaps is what's going to end up happening in Lambertville, that there are sites with no overlay on them, with no affordable housing requirement, that are developing with no affordable housing. That would probably, that would feed the kind of determination that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I think a more clear-cut example would be where you have a site zoned for, a lower density, and everything that's developing around it is being developed at a higher density. I think that would indicate that maybe the density on the site is insufficient. So I guess my point is there are a lot of specifics to that question, but ultimately, yeah, where you have the court evaluating why certain sites have not moved forward, I would expect them to take a look at other sites that are moving forward, just to help inform their opinion as to whether the zoning placed on the properties is adequate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Gina.
So I think Sandra's next.
Yes. Please go ahead, Sandra.
Hi, Sandra Harris, 28 Swan Street. This is incredibly complicated, and I appreciate all the energy that's gone into this meeting. I'm frankly personally overwhelmed. Even though he's not here, I would like to really appreciate the closing comment that Reverend Dobson made, that we should stay engaged. The other questions I have, though, have more to do with process. I'm struggling with a few terms that have been used, and I'd just like to understand them better. One of them is pilot. Another is these rounds. We've talked about the rounds, like I don't know is there a total number? Are the rounds tied to years? So what does that mean? And more specifically to Lambertville, our failure to pass this resolution at our April 23rd City Council meeting puts us at some risk that I don't fully understand. But what I'd really like to know is, Elizabeth, you put up a schematic that showed the process steps. And I just wanted to make sure I understood where in that process we were and what it means that the City Council wasn't able or decided not to approve that resolution. I probably have many other questions, but let me just stop there. You've done a great job, and thank you so much for this.
Oh, thanks, Sandra. So the first one, a pilot, it's called a payment in lieu of taxes. And that's basically whether they can come about in two ways. So if a city or a municipality designates an area as in need of rehabilitation, then they're entitled up to a 5-year tax abatement, which that, sometimes is called a payment in lieu of taxes, even though it's a short-term tax abatement. It's more in a redevelopment designation. Is they're allowed up to, it's a long-term tax abatement, which is up to a 30-year tax abatement. That's generally what's referred to as a pilot, which is that payment in lieu of taxes. And again, it doesn't get the developer doesn't, it's not like they don't pay anything. They don't pay, it's a negotiated payment that they make. That 5% of that payment goes to the county. The rest goes to the city, and the city is able to negotiate a percentage breakdown with the school district instead of having the same set tax rate that every taxpayer has, but they're still making a payment. They're still paying something.
Sure. Beth, would it be possible for you to pull up that slide?
Yeah, I got it. I thought that might be a question.
Yeah, that would be great. And then maybe Emily can explain where we are in this very convoluted process.
Yeah.
Sure. Should I quickly explain the rounds first?
Yeah, why don't you explain the rounds while Beth is.
So
yeah, let me know.
Sandra, the rounds are starting in 1975 is when the first Mount Laurel case happened. And that resulted in what's called Mount Laurel 1 and the first round. And that was from, Beth, please correct me if I get these dates wrong, 1983 to 1987, I think.
Prior round 87 to 93.
Oh, 87 to 93 was the first round. So it was that was the first round period. Then there was second round rules. There was more, more Mount Laurel cases. We're up to Mount Laurel 4, right? 4. And then, sorry, I don't have all of this in front of me. And then, so the second round was from 93 to 1999. The third round was supposed to start in 1999, unfortunately, COA adopted new rules that would have been used for the third round in 2004. The court found them to be invalid. They adopted another set of third round rules in 2008. The court again found those to be invalid, which has kind of led us to this 2015 Supreme Court case, which is why it's now back in the court system. So the third round period that we're in right now, really it's the third round plus what they're calling that gap period. So it goes from 1999 through 2025, but each round is supposed to only be a 10-year round. So that's why we keep saying the next round is going to be the fourth round.
And in a round, what is supposed to happen? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, so in the round, it's you basically have that present need, that rehabilitation obligation. There's the prior round obligation. So right now in the third round, that prior round obligation is the combination of the first and second round new construction obligations.
So it's a calculation of what your obligation is.
Yeah.
For each round. And it's cumulative. So if you didn't meet all of your oblagations in the prior rounds, it just gets added.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You have such a good way of distilling this into like human speak.
And so, for Lambertville moving forward as a vacant land town, that our number, our realistic development potential is set at that 88 and only changes as redevelopment happens. And as Beth pointed out earlier, a great thing about the city's settlement agreement is that because our realistic development potential is calculated at 41, we have this built-in buffer already into our settlement agreement. So as the city redevelops, it doesn't automatically mean we need to create new units to make up for those increases. So it's really moving forward, it's that unmet need, which would likely be the number that would be increasing.
Okay.
Thank you. Want me to share that settlement process slide?
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Slide.
Okay, so this is basically the like standard process that you would go through. You would negotiate the settlement agreement, you'd have your fairness hearing, you'd do all the compliance documents, and then have your compliance hearing. So because Lambertville has been at this since May 2018, when we adopted our first settlement agreement, we had our first fairness hearing September of 2018. And then we had our court order issued in October of 2018. We were supposed to have 120 days from that, which would have put us at February 19 or 2019, sorry, to get through and adopt all of the compliance documents and then have our compliance hearing, which would have been scheduled probably about 45 days after that is typically when they get scheduled. So we are very long due that initial compliance period. So what we're doing now, because the city actually did adopt so many of those compliance documents, and it was really that the last thing that we needed to get through was that the condemnation aspect of that high school site. So our process now is we did the settlement agreement that the governing body approved. And then instead of a fairness hearing, approved housing plan compliance hearing, we're doing the fairness hearing and compliance hearing as one combined hearing because we've adopted so many of those compliance documents already. So our hearing that is coming up next week is that combined fairness and compliance hearing. So not only will the judge be looking at the settlement agreement to determine that it's fair for provides realistic opportunity for low and moderate income households, he's also going to be looking at the compliance documents that we've done so far and identify some conditions of, what are the remaining things the city needs to do. So that the hopeful outcome out of this hearing is what's called a conditional judgment of repose. So the court master issued his report today for that hearing, and in it identifies 6 conditions that the city, he's suggesting there's 6 conditions that the city would have to meet before they can get that final judgment of repose. And then I guess the question about endorsing the housing plan, that's the first condition in the court master's report, saying that council needs to endorse that housing plan within 30 days of the court order after this hearing.
Of the court order for the upcoming hearing or the court order from a past hearing?
From the upcoming hearing. We'll be issued a new court order after this hearing on the 12th, and it'll be within 30 days of that new court order.
I see. And what's the risk that we're worried about? I hear builders, what is it? Builders
remedy.
Right.
Yeah.
So there seemed to be some suggestion that because we delayed, because we're not going into this with the city council approval, we are risking builder's remedy. Do I have that correct?
I think there's...
Emily, do you mind if I just take a stab at this and you tell me if I am wrong? That it's not quite that. That's the concern. The concern that we really discussed at the April meeting, where we postponed taking a vote on endorsing the plan, was the fact that the city has advocated for an extended period of time to actually create the redevelopment plan for the police site, so that we have a lot of time for community meetings and are really able to be specific about what exactly we want that to look like. And so the concern was, if we haven't moved forward on all of these compliance actions, the endorsement being one of them, that the judge would be less favorable to granting that request. The builder's remedy lawsuit is more if we are found to be not compliant and we lose, and the judge rules that we no longer have immunity. But so far we've continued to remain in compliance and hope to continue to remain in compliance. But that specific piece is not pertinent to the delay of.
So it was more that it would have shown, if you will, good faith that we were moving in the right direction, and hopefully give us a stronger case for getting a more extended time period.
Yeah, but we're willing to take the risk that, we have been good faith actors throughout this process. We really do want to get to a good agreement. We have this in place. We really want to make sure that we can engage the community where possible. But, part of the delay here has really been because of the condemnation approach that then resulted in multiple lawsuits against the city, and it really was somewhat out of our hands. So hopefully that will be compelling to Judge Miller.
Right. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, I think this is John Franzini. Go ahead. You can go ahead and
Hi.
there we go.
John Franzini, 154 North Union Street. I want to add my thanks to everyone for their contributions tonight. It's been an interesting evening, and appreciate everybody's contributions. Beth, you had mentioned earlier that in response to a question from someone that if the city identifies a different site other than the police station and wants to go back to the court to approach fair share settlement about getting an amendment and a further amendment to the settlement agreement, that there was some danger in that. Is that, what is that danger?
I think that, I don't know if I'd use the word danger, but I think it does create some challenges for the city. I think it is, I mean, ultimately, what the city's done in 2018 and now in 2020 is you guys have entered into a settlement agreement with another party. And if the city in the future decides, you know what, we don't want to do the police station, or frankly, any other site in the settlement agreement, they want to swap it out for a different site, the city is responsible for then going back to that other party that executed its agreement with, Fair Share Housing Center, and trying to bring them back into negotiations. And so that's something that's going to have to be incentivized. And so the risk is having to go back to Fair Share Housing Center to try to negotiate again for another alternative site. And in doing so, Fair Share may seek additional assurances that the units that are going to be swapped are actually going to be developed. I mean, quite honestly, I would fully expect them to do that. If a municipality came back to them for then a third time seeking an amended settlement agreement, I suspect that they would have concerns about the municipality's commitment to actually implementing any settlement agreement. And so they may want very strict controls to make sure that those units are indeed developed in accordance with those negotiations that would ensue. And so the risk is that the settlement agreement may be difficult to get a settlement agreement that's more advantageous to the city, because it could create the perception that the city is having trouble committing to fulfilling the terms of an agreement. So I think that's a risk.
So that risk
and
really,
not to mention there's also a time and there's a financial risk just to go through the process and to pay your professionals and to do the public notice, do the public meetings, etc.
okay. But given the city's good history with fair share housing and it's fulfilling its commitment to date, that risk would seem to be not as big as it might be with some other circumstances. We've been.
There are certainly a lot of towns that have wronged Fair Share Housing Center, or maybe more accurately put, wronged affordable housing in the state. And Lambertville is certainly not one of them. But I would have, if I were Fair Share, I'd be concerned about a municipality seeking a third amendment to a settlement agreement, and I would want to lock that down as tight as possible, just to try to put it in layman's terms. If you think about any agreement that you might come to with in your personal life, if they came back to a third time for an amendment, you'd start to question their ability to fulfill anything that you guys agreed to. And so there's a risk with that the terms that Fair Share is going to demand in order to enter into another settlement agreement may not be what the city had hoped for.
Okay, fair enough. So I've also heard at some other meetings that we have until 2025 to do something to get this round completed. So do we have time to do if we wanted to try to identify another site and take the risk of seeking another amendment? Do we have time to do that, or do we have until 2025, or do we have some more immediate restriction?
So, John, I think that there's probably two answers to that. We will have more immediate sort of orders coming down from the court shortly on what we have to do per this current settlement agreement. So there will be more immediate actions required of the city based on that. But in terms of the 2025 deadline, I would like a professional to answer that.
Let me just be clear, because I feel like I'm muddying the water a little bit. I do not recommend the city seek an amended settlement agreement with Fair Share. The purpose of these settlement agreements is that the town settles, that they go ahead and implement it for the entirety of the third round, however, as required based on the terms of the agreement. So just because there's technically a process available to a municipality to amend the settlement agreement doesn't mean that that it's going to have a willing partner, and it doesn't mean that even if it does, that it's going to result in agreement that creates more advantages to the community. So let me be really clear. But the other thing is, I think we're all talking about the police station site, but for the police station site, there are going to be requirements that the city go ahead and move that forward. And you can see that, as Emily had referenced in the special master's reports, he had indicated that the city should move forward with adoption of a redevelopment plan and selecting a redeveloper. And so there are certain timelines in place to make sure that the city moves that site forward. And once those steps are in place, the idea of going backwards is going to be made even more difficult. By backwards, I mean not moving forward with the site and instead trying to substitute other properties.
Okay, just one last thing. You mentioned that there's a risk of losing a municipality losing its immunity. Do you know of municipalities who have had that experience?
Yeah, there are quite a few of them around the state. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, West Amwell went through it at one point. I mean, it's a little different. They didn't lose their. Let me answer your question more accurately. Yes, West Amwell went through a builder's remedy litigation, but it was years ago as part of a prior round. In this round, post 2015, there have been municipalities that have lost their immunity. There's South Brunswick, Englewood Cliffs for a couple of them, and it's been devastating, quite honestly, devastating for those towns.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, John. Okay. Dawn, please go ahead.
She's muted.
Yeah.
Dawn, you're still on mute. You might have to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for doing this tonight. It was very helpful. I think all my questions were answered. And I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Councilman Urbish, and thank you, Councilman Taylor, for doing this. And that's really all I have to say.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn.
Matt Hanson, please go ahead.
Hello again. I just want to again thank everyone, of course, for everything. And Madeline, this isn't directed to you, but if and I guess it's more for Beth or Emily, maybe they could answer better. If an elected official represents a lobbying firm and they vote on issues of redevelopment, does that open us to lawsuits in the future for developers that either do or do not get selected for those sites? And what does that look like?
That question demands facts about the specific case. I think in general, no, I don't think there's a bright line standard that you can't have somebody engaged in that work on making municipal decisions. But the details about conflict of interest are going to come down to perhaps the site-specific factors or the particular folks involved in the site and the municipality.
Yeah, and this is really something that we can't address, shouldn't address without the municipal attorney present. And the attorney is not present here. I mean, we all know where this question is coming from. We've seen a lot about it, but the facts about conflict of interest that they're not. They're issue and project and time specific. They are not across the board. So I think if you want to raise that question again at the next council meeting when our attorney is present, that may be a better time.
No, and I appreciate Councilwoman Taylor, your thoughts. It was more a question to figure out if that could be answered here. I didn't really want to make it a bigger issue. I just didn't know the background, if that has happened before or what that looks like, because I've heard it before and I didn't know what the specifics are or if there are specifics around that. So I appreciate that, but I didn't want to make it a bigger issue, but I can ask on a future meeting when the attorney's present.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay,
everybody, we are 2 hours and 40 minutes in and have gotten through all the questions that we said we would get through. I acknowledge that there's one additional hand. I would ask for that person to please send us an email. We will be happy to answer it. But we did make a commitment to our panelists that we would end after the last round of questions had been asked. So I want to thank everybody for your time. Further questions, again, please feel free to email us. We would be happy to organize another one of these events if it would be useful at another time. Feel free to let us know that via email. And I think that's just about it. I want to thank Beth McManus for joining us and for staying with us so late. It's really helpful to have some outside perspective on this.
My pleasure, guys.
And thank you for everyone that stuck with us. I know that this is a lot of complex details, but I think it's wonderful how many people care and want to spend their Thursday evening learning more and providing feedback. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. All right, thanks everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.